We'll wait for another couple of minutes and then we'll start.
Mr. Sawhney, the secretary of METI, is, I think, like a few minutes. He's already in some meeting that is just concluding. But I think we can start. And I just want to welcome all our panelists today, panelists and our participants and the keynote speaker who will be joining us shortly, and everyone who's tuning into this webinar this morning. Before we begin, I just wanted to quickly check with you. We will be recording this session, and I hope everyone's okay with it. If you are, could you just quickly give me like a raise hand from your feature and just so that I know that everyone's comfortable with the recording of the session. Hello.
Good morning.
Good morning, sir. Thank you for joining us today. All right. I think we're all here. Mr. Matthan from Trilegal will join us in a bit. He just texted. And I think we can start though. So, as I said, good morning, everyone. My name is Amin Johar. I'm a senior resident fellow at the Vidhi Center for Legal Policy, and I lead the Center for Applied Law and Tech Research within Vidhi. I extend a warm welcome to all our participants and the keynote speaker, Mr. Ajay Sawhney, and to everyone who's tuning in to this webinar this morning. Before we commence, I just want to take a moment and introduce every person who's here visible on the screen right now. For the keynote address, we are honored to be joined by Shri Ajay Sawhney. He is currently serving as Secretary of MeitY, which is the Ministry for Electronics and Information Technology of the Government of India. Mr. Sawhney is an alumnus of IIT Delhi and a 1984 IAS officer from the Andhra Pradesh cadre. And in his position as the Secretary to the Government of India, he's played a pivotal role in easing policy and facilitating the Digital India initiative that is being driven by the government. For our panel today, we have a very interesting and eclectic set of experts. We have Mr. Madhukar, who is the investment partner at Omidyar Network India. He's also the co-founder of PRS, which has been the leading Indian nonprofit working with parliamentarians on legislative research across sectors. We also have Ms. Richa Roy, a partner from Cyril, Amarchand, Mangaldas, and she was a part of the team that worked with us, with Vidhi and the other collaborators in the drafting of our position paper on non-personal data and data trusts. Ms. Roy's professional background spans over insolvency and bankruptcy laws, finance regulation, and public policy matters. We're also going to be joined by Mr. Rahul Matthan, who's a partner at Trilegal, heading their technology, media, and telecommunication practice. Mr. Matthan has written on several issues within the tech policy domains, including his books on informational privacy and internet governance, which I would strongly recommend for anyone who is even like a novice or like a foundational reader in the space should definitely consult. We also have the pleasure of being joined by Ms. Tatiana Peralta Quiros from the World Bank, all the way from Costa Rica. She is a technology and transport specialist who has a vast experience of working with governments to operationalize and pilot digital data and innovative technology for transportation projects. Adding to this list of non-lawyers, we also have Ms. Astha Kapoor, who is the co-founder of Aapti Institute. Aapti is a public research institution examining and utilizing real-life experiences and perspectives from the intersection of technology and how it interacts with society within its work. Finally, we have our very own Ms. Trishi Jindal, who is a research fellow at Vidhi, working with the Center for Applied Law and Tech Research. Trishi is one of the lead authors for this position paper on data trusts and non-personal data governance, along with Mr. Anirudh Nigam, who is also a research fellow working with the center. We also have our distinguished team of technologists and collaborators from IIIT Delhi, Mr. Pravesh Bayani and Mr. Atul Jain. Pravesh is an alumnus of both IIT Bombay and IIT Delhi, the latter for his PhD. He won the Inspire Faculty Award given by the Government of India and is currently working as the Inspire Faculty at IIIT Delhi. Atul is working as a research assistant with him at IIIT Delhi, which also happens to be his alma mater. Both of them have been instrumental in the design of the pilot that will be demonstrated later in today's session. So, just to give an overview, our conversations today are going to focus on the governance of non-personal data within India. As the name suggests, non-personal data or NPD typically refers to data sets that may not be revealing sensitive personal information, but nonetheless serve as vital collective information that can be harnessed in multiple ways. These data sets can be the foundation of creating public serving applications, machine learning tools that foster AI innovation, and also prove invaluable to market researchers, to name some garden variety users of non-personal data. Given this context, as was also briefly discussed within the Sri Krishna Committee report, there is a need to consider governance frameworks for NPD when we talk about data governance as a larger umbrella issue. And the Indian government is already taking some concrete steps in this direction. Last year, they constituted an expert committee headed by Chris Gopalakrishnan, which was constituted by MeitY to look into this whole issue of governing and regulating the use of non-personal data. The draft report was published earlier this year, and it came out with some laudable ideas, prominently featuring community interests as an idea within this debate. It also espoused data trusts for safeguarding these interests. While this draft report is a commendable first step towards formulating robust stewardship models for non-personal data, there are more granular details which require examination and study. For instance, the inclination towards data trusts needs to be justified. We need to compare it to other possibly more laissez-faire models like data exchanges. Law and policy questions need to be answered, whether the existing legislative framework is adequate or needs changes or complete overhaul. It is this nitty-gritty that we have aimed to unravel in our position paper, which was published last month in collaboration with our intellectual partners, IIIT Delhi, Cyril Amarchand Mangaldas, and Omidyar Network India. While the paper discusses the institutional elements, IIIT Delhi's team, led by Pravesh, has been working hard to create the technology layer for a quasi-data trust. They are currently piloting the same using urban mobility data that is collected by the Delhi government. This data, to put it simply, can prove useful, as I had mentioned earlier, in designing numerous user-centric applications for sophisticated ticketing, better routing, real-time location detection, etc., and thereby improve the overall commuter experience. Our session will start with the keynote address by Mr. Sawhney, providing insights into how the government and the policy makers are considering the issues surrounding NPD. This will be followed by a quick and very insightful demonstration of the UMD pilot that has been designed by the IIIT Delhi team. Finally, we will have the panel discussion focusing on the main issues surrounding NPD's governance, as well as deliberate how data trusts like the pilot that has been designed by Pravesh and his team can be operationalized and scaled sustainably. With this, I hand over the mic to Mr. Sawhney and request him to kindly deliver his keynote address. Over to you, sir.
Very good morning to all the dignitaries who are present in this, the experts who are present in this program. I think it's at this point, data is very high on our mind, the privacy aspects of it and various other aspects of how to leverage data for economic growth I think is extraordinarily important at this point of time for India and for the globe. The As Aminji has very rightly mentioned, uh, we have significant work going on in various ways on different aspects of data privacy, of how data has to be collected, processed, shared, protected, and who actually owns the data, who has an interest in data, how do you protect legitimate interests, how do you avoid exploitation in a manner that infringes the rights of the individuals or the communities or the I would say even the country to which the data belongs. So in this direction, we have moved with many on many fronts. The personal data protection bill is before the parliament. It's before a joint committee. The joint committee currently is meeting almost on a daily basis. In fact, these are full day meetings where the clause by clause work also is being looked at. The we hope that in the coming year we will see this go through the parliament, and we hope to see it as a legislation soon. Again, it will take some more time for the different sections of the legislation to become operational. So there'll be preparatory time, for all the stakeholders to understand their rights, their responsibilities, what kind of infrastructure, what kind of mechanisms they need to set up to be in compliance with the data protection legislation that will come in. As Amin has also mentioned, the a wonderful committee, a really fabulous committee with some of the finest experts has been has come together under the leadership of Mr. Chris Gopalakrishnan. They came out with the first draft of their paper uh, uh, sometime earlier this year. There was extensive response to that, amazing amount of response, very good, very excellent ideas have come in through that process. I am told or I am given to understand that another draft is now almost ready, and it's quite possible because of the very large number of responses that had come in that the committee might once again like to unveil its draft and take a further round of suggestions because this is work which is seminal work. It has huge implications and impact as we move into the digital economy. I think it's data from Indian data, data belonging to Indians, data belonging to Indian communities is one of the key assets key resources that we all hope to leverage for growth of our digital economy, for growth of businesses, Indian businesses, businesses in India, and others that participate in accordance with the rules and norms and the uh, methods of ensuring fairness and transparency that get laid down in the course of time. So it's very important for us to get these elements right, and I think it's off to a good and robust start. both of these processes, the process around the personal data protection and the non-personal data, have benefited from very widespread and in some cases very deep and intense amount of engagement that we have had with the public, with experts, many of whom are participating in today's deliberations. And it has actually, these processes have further boosted my confidence and the confidence also of the government in the strength that we have within India, in the wide and varied experiences and the depth of knowledge that many of our people possess. And I would also venture to say that some of the concepts that we have come up with collectively and have embedded both in our personal data protection legislation and also in the non-personal data, the paper, are pioneering thoughts, are frameworks that the world is looking at very carefully. And I expect these to be, the sort of make their way to be recognized as the best of breed, the best thinking at the current level. These are, of course, subjects that are in their infancy, still in their infancy. It's still to mature with more and more countries joining in. When we actually implement these, we will get to, we'll have a lot of learning while implementing these. There is learning already from the GDPR implementation and implementation in other countries as well. But as we move not only into the personal data protection, but also into various aspects of handling of non-personal data, and as we start recognizing, still, these are a bit nebulous. The still a little unclear as to how exactly does data harvested well, harnessed well, actually have an impact on digital businesses. What are the right practices? What are the fair practices? What are the practices that a country should lay down as a model? What is where do you, what is the boundary? Up to what do you regulate and what do you leave to mechanisms, and what you do not regulate directly, how do you also put in place the mechanisms that will help implement some of these very difficult new areas. Among these, the issue of establishing data trusts, I think, is extraordinarily important. The protection of personal data lends itself to slightly different kinds of mechanisms. But especially with both personal and non-personal data, I think the idea of data trusts, I think, is going to be very significant. And again, it's a reasonably new area for everyone. There are very few established or settled models in this, and I am, for one, really delighted that some of the best minds in academia, in entities like Vidhi, in people from entities like Cyril Mangaldas and from Trilegal, as well as people in academia who have done a deep thinking about many of these, both from the technology side and from the legal side, are actually coming together and spending the time to uh, help us sort of look more deeply at the detailing, at the nuances. First of course, getting the big ideas right is going to be extremely important, and then the nuances are going to be extremely important as well. So I'm hoping that your deliberations will further delve into the various issues pertaining to personal, non-personal data, and especially to data trusts. And that what comes out of your deliberations, the initial thinking and the initial draft looks very promising. And I hope that with these deliberations, you are actually able to come up with something that works for all of us and that can become a role model for the other countries as well to emulate. I think it's time for India to not just, remain as, we seem to have um, I won't say believed, but we have actually practiced, at least for the past several decades, where we look at a model that has emerged somewhere else and then sort of try to improve upon that. I think it's extremely important. This is 2020. 20s is the decade of India. I truly believe that it's India's decade. And it's India's time to come up with models that the world looks at and then does some cut and paste and some improvisation on what comes out of India. And I hope that the ideas that you are discussing today will be among those in which India will be a trailblazer. Um, Best wishes from my side to all of you. And I have very high expectations from what you will finally end up bringing to us. Thank you for involving me in today's program. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Sawhney. That was actually quite insightful on a number of aspects, as well as very inspiring as well. I think for me personally, like the two big takeaways are that one, it is fantastic that the government is looking to an even more expansive set of stakeholder engagement within academia and across different intersections. That is, in my opinion, like the bedrock of sound evidence-based policy making. And also the fact, like I completely echo the sentiment that for too long, not just in technology policy but across different domains, policy in India has been driven more on a derivative fashion from what the European and North American perspectives are providing. And it is probably time to focus more on like our indigenous models and indigenous research which fuels those models. So I think those are two very strong takeaways. With that, I want to now pass over the mic to my colleague Anirudh, as well as Pravesh and Atul, to quickly take us through this pilot that the Triple IT Delhi team has created. It is, I think, like the most vital sort of utility of this pilot is the fact that it showcases that the technology that is going to facilitate the creation of a data trust is it's not inconceivable. It is very much plausible, and I think their pilot showcases that and presents like a solid evidence and a use case of that. So with that, Anirudh, over to you.
Yeah, thank you, Amin. So I was part of the team that worked on this position paper with a number of collaborators. And we realized, as Sir also said rightly, that when you talk about data trust, there are many different conceptualizations of data trust which are at play in different contexts, including in the context of personal data and non-personal data, as well as in the context of many different sectors. And we wanted to ensure that our work on this subject is sensitive and alive to experiential and practical insights that exist in these different sectors. In that context, our collaboration with the team at IIIT Delhi, which was led by Pravesh, was highly fruitful and productive in terms of understanding the context of mobility data in Delhi and in India. And one of the objectives of our effort was to see if we can set up a pilot data trust today. And as part of that effort, we actually ended up having to navigate a number of questions and considerations that we realized we have to be alive to in the formulation of this position paper. And what we realized as part of this question of setting up a pilot data trust is that there are really two questions within that fold. One is the question of the institutional layer of the data trust, which is the subject of the position paper and the subject of the discussion that the panel is going to engage in later today, and which deals with these questions of how a data trust makes decisions, who controls it, and what goes into the documentation and the responsibilities of the various stakeholders and entities associated with a data trust. But the other question, which was equally important, was the technological layer of a data trust and the technological platform, which actually is sort of the product that is accessible by stakeholders when they talk about accessing a data trust. And the team at IIIT Delhi has a working prototype of what that technological layer could look like. And I think a demonstration of that prototype is perhaps something that is incredibly crucial, because it's something that not only helps us navigate questions related to the institutional layer, but it also really demonstrates that we're not very far away from looking at data trusts as realistic entities that operate and function in India or in any sector. So without more ado, I would invite Pravesh to uh, talk about the technological layer of a data trust and demonstrate the prototype of the pilot that we've been working on.
Sure. Thank you, Anirudh. I'll just start with sharing my screen first. And my colleague Atul will take over from me after the initial slides to actually go through the website of our data trust. So I hope you can see my screen.
Yes, Pravesh.
Okay, great. So I'll not take much time. I'll straight away jump to the point. But I just want to finish what Mr. Sawhney started with. That comment of his that we don't have to cut copy paste from the West, and we have to look at what is happening in the ground in India and derive our ideas, derive our principles, derive our framework from there. So I'll just talk about what we have learned from our experiment in Delhi, and what are the main points that we understand, at least from the technology point of view, and at least some of them have also flown in the position paper that Vidhi team has taken out. So here's my presentation. So basically, all this talk about data trust for public data or public good, there's a key sentiment or key thing here, which is sharing of that data. So why do we think public data sharing is useful? And this is not something new. We understand all this, but it's very important to still remember them at the back of our mind, because at times when we get into the policy making and into the nitty-gritties of everyday life, we forget about the reason why we want to share the data. And this should always be kept in mind. So from our experiment in Delhi, where we tried to share public transit data to everybody, we immediately realized that it actually helps in building solutions for the benefit of public itself. So all the apps or all the technology that can be built on top of data actually benefits public. That's the number one. Number two thing is actually helps in transparency in terms of governing our public institutions. So sharing data is also helpful in transparency, and it actually sometimes becomes a problem also. And of course, when we have a better system, it makes the impact impact wider. So the system becomes efficient and the impact becomes wider. And finally, it improves research and effective policy making. So we should understand that when public data is shared, public benefits the most. Of course, others also benefit, and we have to keep in mind the benefit of everybody around us, but the most important beneficiary is actually public, and we should never forget this point. And so while we get into understand, while data sharing is important, what are the main hurdles in data sharing? Because these are ground level issues that has to be taken into account when we formulate any policy, right? It's very easy to sit in our rooms and not understand what's going on the ground. So this is absolutely coming from my experience and my team's experience in sharing data. First of all, the most important hurdle is lack of collection of data. Most of the Indian institutions, and I can very confidently talk about transportation, actually there's not enough even collection of data. Then the second thing is that we are not even aware of usefulness of sharing. While it's very easy to say that sharing is good, but actually the message has to be drilled down to the last level of governing in the institution, that actually benefits of sharing data is to really put it in our system is very important. We have to understand. And a very important awareness that is not there is that actually in longer run, sharing actually has a very good ROI, very, very huge return on investment. We have to always be clear about that. Finally, one of the main hurdles is that there is no framework exist right now, and the project that Omidyar has given us with Vidhi and IIIT actually discusses this framework in much detail in the position paper, as well as the technology that we have built. Finally, when the data is collected, after the data is collected, of course, sometimes data is not even collected, but once the data is collected, there's a lack of willingness to share. And this is a very, very important point, that we have to understand what the government officials always think. They may not say it right away, is that they do understand that sometimes somebody may find something that they don't want them to find. This is a very important point, and we have to understand to make rules that safeguard them when they share the data. Finally, many officials do believe that private companies can make money, and which is also fine as long as public benefits. So this view that why should anybody make money has to be dispelled as soon as possible. Finally, there's a real danger of data sharks, or in my experience, the contracts that don't encourage data sharing is a very huge hurdle. Finally, data sharing costs money, which basically means that we have to find a sustainable way of sharing data, sustainable model behind sharing data, which brings me to the main point of ROI. I mean, once we engage people on ROI, it easily, they are more amenable to sharing the data, even when it costs money to them. So finally, I just don't want to take too much time. We opened the data of transit data in Delhi almost 18 months or around 2 years back, and this was a one of its kind project in India, where we are actually sharing real-time data of around more than 3,000 buses, and there's a static data also. So now it's very important to understand that putting a data set inside in a website, a static data or an Excel file, is not same as sharing real-time data. Sharing real-time data involves its own technology component. So we opened that data. However, what we understand is that this was a data sharing in silos, which basically means that there was no common standard protocols that we followed that was agreed by everybody. We devised our own protocols and we followed them. There was not sufficient distribution, which means basically difficulty in marketing, because once you share the data, you also want others to know that you have shared the data. On the other side, users were not even aware that we have shared the data. So there's both side problem, supply and demand problem, both together. And finally, it's very individual or researcher dependent. So tomorrow, if my team disappears, then this whole thing just collapses. So it should be basically we have to understand that data sharing should not be in silos. It has to be systemic, and it has to be systematic too. So this is a very, very important point regarding sharing data, that we don't have to share data in silos, which may not be as useful as it can be. And we need a very systematic and institutional framework for stewarding data, which is exactly the purpose of this project. So finally, how to create an institutional mechanism. Sharing is great. We can share data, but how to create a formal institutional mechanism to share it? The position paper that Vidhi team will talk about later exactly answers that question. From our side, we have created a technological framework, or for at least for transit data, where we show that we have created like a centralized place for data sharing, which has a lot of features that are technological or a centralized repository may demand. And these are the features that we have thought about. All these features have come out from our experience of sharing data and by talking to other folks. Basically, we have to understand that data is not just static, it's real time and it updates very, very frequently. In fact, Tati, my another colleague at World Bank, we worked together for Chennai data, and we realized very quickly that sharing is easier, updating and again sharing is the difficult part. So we have to make sure that we can update our sets very frequently. We have to make provisions for that update very very efficient. And of course, access control is important. Not everybody should have access to every data, or not all data should be shared to everybody, which basically means that the owner of the data can provide or revoke access in a very, very seamless fashion. Security is very important. Privacy is very important. We also have to understand data quality issues that may be there, which means that your framework should be able to talk about the data quality issues at least at some level. Of course, different data sets have different licenses. There should be dashboards, analytics, and finally the system should always be on, and it should be scalable. And very, very important that it should allow commercial usage, which basically means that we have to also understand how the data trust should be positioned so that it can also act as a intermediary between the data owner and the data user through commercial licenses and commercial practices. So keeping these in mind, we have built our system, and I'll request my colleague Atul to go through that system. Atul?
Yeah, hi. I'll just share my screen. Okay. So you have to stop sharing your screen before I can.
Yes, I'm trying that.
Yeah. Okay. So yeah, so datatrust.in. So this is the prototype we have built. So this is a landing page. These are basic features which Dr. Pravesh just highlighted: uptime, stay in control, data protection, exchange methods, visibility and reach, notifications, regular updates about the data, analytics, and easy updations for transit agencies. There are a couple of data sets we have added, which are real, like for Delhi, static as well as real time. So for real time, you have to request access and the transit agency has to approve it. For static, it is open and a simple form can be filled. And you can download the data. So I'll quickly go through slides. So this is the technological flow of data and data access in our data trust pilot. So here on the right, there is data transit agency with their data. They upload the data on data trust. DTM. So before going further, so TAM is transit agency. DTM is data trust manager, a moderator kind of person who will moderate the data upload part as well as granting access to the user. And then there's a user who is the end consumer of the data. So data is uploaded by transit agency on the data trust. Then DTM screens that data and allows it to be uploaded. Then the consumer can request further data, and both DTM and transit agency has to approve the access once. And once the consumer has the approval, they can easily download the data via API keys. So here's a small demo on how transit agency can upload the data. So essentially we have working in transit sector, we have observed that there are two kinds of data primarily. One is static, one is real time. Static can be data such as routes information, stops, location, etc., which change very rarely, once a year maybe. So it doesn't have to be real time. So there's a simple form for that. This is transit agency's dashboard. They go and create a new data set. They fill in the essential information such as title, upload the data file, specify the format of data, and documentation, which is very crucial for end user to understand how the data is readable, and license. Then there are two methods of data access: open to everyone. Like I just downloaded it, that data set was open, and there's a way of uploading the data. So right now the transit agency is manually uploading the file. So other way is restricted data. So in Delhi we have we have opened the data for 3,000 buses. It is live right now. So it updates every 10 seconds for all the buses. That data has to be updated on the data trust as well frequently for the end consumer to get the real-time data. So here we have a flexibility to add real-time data URL for the transit agencies and the updation frequency in seconds, for example, 10 seconds or 15 seconds. And the data trust will keep on fetching data from the transit agencies servers, and the consumer can access that data via data trust. Of course, this URL won't be the transit agency's URL will be encapsulated and won't be shown to the user for security purpose. So security has been the main point lately. So we have a couple of latest standards of security inbuilt. So one is primarily HTTPS protocol. So all the user authentication data sharing parts it takes place over HTTPS, which means that all the data will be encrypted and shared with the user, and no one in the middle can sniff on the data and decipher the data. So this is a very, very layman example. So this is how HTTPS works. So if I want to share this string, this readable format, so after encryption, it becomes like garbage to anyone who's sniffing in the middle. Other security measure we have taken is API key. So API key is unique to every user and a long non-guessable key, and a user can download the data with API key only. So any user cannot guess anyone else's API key, and a user can access only data sets granted access to it himself only, and no other data set. So here's a small demo on how consumers can request for data set. So right now I'm logged in as a consumer in this. I go to a data set. I request access for that. There's a simple form a user has to fill every time. So now request is pending with the DTM as well as the transit agency to approve. So this is a one-time process. Once approved, user can easily access the data via API key. Next slide. So here, the transit agency is actually granting access to the user. Right now, I'm logged in as a transit agency. So I'll go to my data sets, go to a specific data set. Okay, sorry, so subscription. Okay, so yeah, I go to subscriptions. I see all the consumers who are accessing my data right now. I can see pending requests there. I can provide access by clicking on the check mark, and the user will get the access. Okay, so how consumers can download their data using their API key. So once the transit agency approves the request for consumer access, again, consumer can go to we can see it's approved. Consumer can use the link there. So, okay. So here the consumer has to fill in their unique API key. It can be seen in settings and show API key. So once your consumer sets API key, you can see the data is downloaded there. So this is a brief like flow end to end, how data was uploaded, how consumer requested for data, and how transit agency approved the data request, and how end consumer can download the data.
So, Atul, if I may just.
Yeah.
So through this demo, what we have essentially shown is that any transit agency or any transportation data provider can simply create their account here, log in, and upload their data sets either through manual uploading or through URLs that they may upload here, and the platform will essentially keep on collecting the data, and the data consumers can, through a similar process, by relevant access control by the transit agencies or by the data trust itself, because the control is at both the ends, both the data trust manager and the transit agency or the data provider can simply download the data by process of relevant access control. And hopefully this will be used by a lot of folks around not just India, maybe even outside, where they can immediately share the transit data and the transportation data for others to consume. So this is essentially right now for transit data, but such a system, such a mechanism can be easily provided for other data sets as well, healthcare, education, or for cases where we have not even thought about data sharing yet. So this is the platform is data data source agnostic as of now. As of now, it's for transit, but eventually it can easily become data source agnostic. So that's the demo that we have created. Ami?
Thanks a lot, Pravesh and Atul. I think, again, like seeing how, like to us, it's taken you the better part of, I think, almost a year and a half in creating and finessing this platform to where it is now. But I think when you showcase it in a demo like this, it seems very plausible. It seems like the technology is nothing that outlandish that we cannot conceptualize it. I think what is relevant now is to debate how within how to operationalize and scale such a platform where, as you mentioned, that there is this unwillingness from multiple entities on data sharing. We've had this conversation privately as well when we were discussing on that part of the position paper. And I think that's a nice segue to like where we are with our panel, where I would like to invite all of our panelists once again. Before we begin on the panel discussion, just a couple of quick housekeeping rules. One is that because there are 6 panelists, it's a large panel, so I would request everyone to kindly be pithy and precise in their comments, myself included. And the second is that, time permitting, we will probably open the last 5 to 10 minutes of our session for questions from the audience and take it from there. So with that, I want to start with the first question. I want to circle back to something that was there in Mr. Sawhney's speech as well, something that has featured within the draft report of the expert committee and something that has become a rallying point in most discussions on non-personal data governance, which is public interest. As Pravesh mentioned, that is like public interest, community interest. What is the benefit and how do you preserve it? So for that, I would basically request Mr. Madhukar to share his thoughts. The idea of community interest seems to be akin to the logic that like a data principle vis-a-vis personal data has control and autonomy over the use of that data and where it gets shared. I think that is one element which is quintessential when we talk about community interest, that community interest is to be preserved to give autonomy of the community over the data that is collected from it, even if it is not personal information. So my question is that, does this mean that community interest is paramount, or is it something that should be treated at parity with other competing interests. As Pravesh had mentioned, there is a commercial element that should be considered when we are talking about data trusts, which makes it viable for the data user and potentially incentivizes other entities also to open up their data sets. So how do we balance this? The autonomy of the community in preserving the interest of the community in preserving their autonomy over the use of the data, the sharing of the data, as well as like the other competing interests that may come from data users and corporations that want access to it to design applications that can benefit the larger public.
Thank you, Ami, and thank you for the opportunity to be here. I will preface my comments with that I've really engaged on this one, but not nearly as much as all of my fellow panelists. So I might be allowed maybe to make a few out-of-the-box provocative comments with your permission, I mean. And so here are I'll make 3 or 4 different points and maybe worth unpacking a little bit. The first is that the current model of the internet, the free model of the internet, really serves the public good. I just want to make that point because for instance, there is a reason why we have Google Maps, right? It's free. It helps us, and so it serves a certain public good. And to the extent that there are public good models which basically are liked by a lot of people and are widely adopted, then you end up with the current internet model. Okay, I just wanted to preface my comments with that. And so the current internet model is viable as long as there is unfettered access to our personal data that a lot of technology companies take out from our phones and devices. There is little or no cost to actually doing it, except the customer acquisition cost and the technology build. And then there is little or no liability really, despite all of the GDPRs of the world. There is little or no liability for using data in certain ways. And therefore, as long as this sort of unfettered access to our data, as long as there's no control over what data can be collected or cannot be collected by any provider of any service, the need for inventing something for public good in the non-profit space or in the what we call community good space, as you framed, might actually be taken over by corporations, which may or may not be at odds with what we're trying to solve for. I just wanted to, because I think that the conversation around data trust happens to be a lot about and you mentioned this non-profit models on the one hand, and the exploration that can it be for profit, and so right. So I think the current model, internet model, actually serves well a lot of the public good. I'm not saying it's perfect. It's far from perfect. I just absolutely have to make that clear. It's very exploitative and a whole bunch of challenges there, but I wanted to frame that right. So I think the data trust effort is important from a couple of additional reasons. One is that to the extent that there is a time when collecting more data and storing it becomes a liability for corporations, then they probably collect less. If there is ever if there's moral pressure, legal pressure, penalties for losing data, whatever, right? There might be a day when collecting too much data might not be the right thing. The second is that there are incentives for these corporations to share this data out in quote unquote public trusts of some kind. And that could be maybe a tax incentive. If you actually share so much of your data, you actually get a tax rebate on so and so. It is another matter that most internet corporations don't pay taxes anywhere in the world, which is a whole different question on equity and how value is distributed in this current internet model. So I think that the value of the data trusts really is in finding that sweet spot between what is the private sector in the current model solving, and defining, therefore, in the current internet model, here are the 5 or 6 things that can't be solved in the current internet model, and therefore the need for data trust. I know we've had pilots both in India and outside of how this can be built out, and transport is a good example, and I think exploring that through pilots is a good one. I think a last couple of points. The pilots are extremely important, but I worry that they've remained pilots. For instance, the experiment we're doing in Delhi right now has been tried out in Bangalore in the past, Pune in the past, where thousands of buses were tagged with GPS devices, and data was collected, and there was an app developed, and some hundreds of people, or maybe a few thousand people in Bangalore downloaded it, but it died, right? So there is something there to unpack as to why it is. Experiments in India for sure, and even experiments globally haven't quite scaled to become like Google Maps is scaled, right? So there's a reason why that is scaled and why data trusts aren't scaling. So I think there's something to unpack there on the incentive. I think look, the mechanics of the sharing and all of that can be worked out. I think the big open question to me is what does it take to scale these, to make these substantial? Otherwise, these are nice pet projects. We can write a paper or two and unpack some learnings, which is all very useful, but really will not solve a fundamental problem. So I'm wondering whether there is whether the data trust model needs to be seen in the overall ecosystem of what we have right now, which is solving for the problem, and therefore what are the gaps, and therefore how do we fill that? I think on the paper itself, I thought the paper was very good to start with, and had a lot of very useful ways to think about the challenges that need to be addressed in law. I think the primary set of questions, and I'm not saying all of this needs to be addressed in law, is there's some reference to local level community-based consultations in the position paper. Given the data so seamless, I wonder if community-based consultations make sense. I mean, from a sociological perspective, from a engagement of citizens perspective, it all makes sense. But really, what is a practical manifestation of something like that is not very clear to me. There's also, I think, the question of rights and obligations of both data providers and data users. I think that would be worth spelling out a little bit in law, and a little bit left to notifications and practice. And third is, I would say despite all of the public good nature of this, there should be something said about consent, and how do we build some consent architecture, even if it's not perfect, to actually have some level of consent in law. And so, to me, look, this law is useful, but the more important question is who will contribute data and why, who will use data and why, and what is broken in the current model that we're trying to solve here, which will then allow data trust to actually scale and become something that's important, an important part of infrastructure for our communities, for our states, for our country, right? I think those are some of the sort of opening remarks that I had, which are all somewhat incoherent, but I thought would cover a few pieces that I've been thinking about for a while.
No, I do agree. I think, again, I do recognize the challenge that one is to theorize about what you said, that community interests and representation at a grassroots level model. That is always, I think, social science researchers always intend to postulate that as your solution for bringing in the diversity and the reality of grassroots representation. But I think in law, capturing that element has always proven to be a challenge. But
sorry, just one last point. I mean, I think, look, the idea of commons is well established in so many other domains. But in data, I think it's particularly challenging for a number of reasons. And I think we would do well to look at the incentive structure for both participants across the ecosystem.
Yeah. So I just want to also one of your points on how data trusts can sort of facilitate in finding what you termed as the sweet spot between the dichotomy of interests. There is your community interest, and there is your commercial element of it, and like the scalability of the data trust and incentivizing people to open up their data sets to such models. I just wanted to pose this to both Mr. Matthan and Astha, since they have like very different backgrounds. Mr. Matthan, from a legal standpoint, where would you see this sweet, like how do basically, like if we are talking about community interest and its crucial nature, how do we safeguard it? Like we, as Mr. Madhukar also pointed out, our paper talks about the commons approach, but finding this within data space is a bit tricky. And Astha, to you, it's more from like, as we said, that there is this welfare element to community data, and that being the case, where can the law provide a safeguard versus where do you need maybe like a more softer measure and like a soft approach, possibly like some kind of self-regulatory standards or industry practices, something along those lines that can help that?
Do you want me to go first? I mean, I'm happy to go first.
Yes.
First of all, thank you for organizing this. Also for writing the paper. I've read it in some detail. Very interesting in the many things that it covers. I have many points of disagreement, but completely academic and in good spirit, and I will write it up and send it to you. I wanted to, in answering your question, which was derived from Madhukar's question, I wanted to just pick up on some of the things that Madhukar said to hopefully expand on it. I mean, so in order to find the sweet spot, I think let's be guided by that thing that Madhukar pointed out in his comments, which is at some point in time, when collecting data becomes a liability to corporations, they will stop collecting data. And we've got to, in finding the sweet spot, that's a very good way to figure out the sweet spot. And that leads me to trying to think about this in the context of what is the data that we're looking to open. So the current pilot has worked off of public data, as in data that's created by a government agency, which is therefore created out of public funds. And I would argue that if there's a government agency that is using public funds to create data, and that data is valuable in other sectors, I think there is an incentive to actually share that data. In fact, I think there is an imperative to share that data, given that there could be value to society to share that data. So the sweet spot there really becomes identifying, how the data was created, and if it was created out of public funds, there is an implicit and immediate imperative to share that data in the public interest. I think the layers there would be, we've got to be careful about privacy, because at least from the pilot, I saw that the data was being dumped, in a sense, in a raw fashion. And I would imagine that we have to layer on top of that filters for privacy and other individual, to protect against individual harm. But if you go to the collection of exactly the same sort of data set from a private individual, and the obvious example then becomes, Ola and Uber, which have similar sorts of data, we've got to be very careful about the data that we extract from them or force them to provide from that framing and from the lens that Madhukar used, because at some point in time, it will become, they will have no incentive to continue to collect data. Now, why is this important? If the government is asked to share data, the government is collecting data in any event. If they've digitized their systems, that data exists. It's a question of opening it up. Private entities actually collect data because of some problem that they are solving. Usually that problem is internal efficiencies, because they want to become a corporate entity that's providing services in a more efficient manner. The bottom line for that is they want to improve their profits, but essentially that is the reason why they're doing it. And at some point in time, if you erode that efficiency, and let me just put it in an example that I think the lawyers, including Vidhi in this room, will understand. I am a law firm. Richa is from a law firm. It is possible, and we all have data. If someone asks me to share the data of Trilegal, how did Trilegal manage? What are the data points that can demonstrate how Trilegal managed to build its operational efficiencies? That is a competitive advantage for me, and that is not something that I'd be inclined to share. Vidhi has done exceptional work in the field that it is in, but there is a data-driven model behind it. Even if you don't know it, if you collect it, someone can look at it and figure it out. And at some point in time, you'll just say, look, I won't collect that data anymore because it actually affects my competitive interest. So in arriving at that particular model, and particularly in the context of private sector data, we've got to be very mindful of this because I think the private sector is extraordinarily good at collecting data and finding uses for it. We shouldn't, kill the goose that lays the golden egg, but we should find a way to take that data out in a manner that addresses the sweet spot. Which leads me to my final point, and this is actually not in criticism to anything that's written in the paper, because the paper actually inherits this taxonomy from the NPD committee, and quite frankly, from the way in which the Sri Krishna committee looked at it. And that is this exclusionary definition of what it is that we're after. Right? So if we are talking about NPD as everything other than personal data, what we're then bringing in the mix is all this data that you and Vidhi, me and Trilegal, Richa and Amarchand, and Uber, Ola, everyone doesn't want to share. But if we can pick out high value data, which has, and there's some way to define it, which has some benefit to a community, and we can define that properly, that I think is a sort of a better way to go about it. So narrow the focus. Let's not say everything that is not public data shall be governed in this new regime. Let's instead focus, and I think it's the low-hanging fruit is government data, because government data is essentially created out of public funds, and there is a public interest to it. We could also perhaps find some high-value data sets that are not commercially sensitive, such that companies continue to have the incentive to collect those data sets and other data sets like them, without the fear that if they do so, it will be nationalized by the state. So I'm going to stop there. I have some comments on governance, which I'm sure Astha has thought about this, so she'll probably raise that, or maybe we'll discuss that later as well.
Right. Thanks a lot. No, I think that especially that last bit about the exclusionary nature of the definition, I feel that's a very valid criticism on how expansive non-personal data is. It's like a residuary clause that is there covering everything that you haven't defined under the PDP bill originally and said that, okay, now everything else needs to be covered. But when you talk about its practical implications, I do realize that even from a utility perspective, it might serve better purpose to maybe focus it down more and get a more crystallized definition. Astha?
Yeah, thank you so much. And thanks for the wonderful paper and the presentation by Pravesh. I also, like Rahul, have some disagreements, which I can send to you offline. But just on the question of the community, I think this is something that we've been grappling with as well. And, the community in the paper has been just put forward as some amorphous entity that's, the interests of which are aligned, and the community that knows how to engage with each other. There's also the sense that this data trust can unlock and bring the communities to the same plane and have them negotiate on data rights, which I think is an incorrect assumption. And I think that, the more we think about it, the more we realize that this conversation is very premature. I think that we need to create a much bigger ecosystem that fosters data sharing, instead of using this stick of mandatory data sharing that has been, said out loud in the report, and then create these mechanisms like data trust that we don't necessarily know very well at the moment to help sort of deliver on this idea of the stick and say, actually, this is for the benefit of the community. But actually what the NPD is doing is, bringing this data out, making it available to seemingly Indian businesses. I don't think that we've discussed the fact that the NPD is actually a way of, sort of like Rahul said, nationalizing or making data available to Indian businesses. And in that, the community seems like a bit of an afterthought, and the mechanisms that, like the trust that I just mentioned, that have been put forward are also not clearly defined. And that's just because it is an afterthought. In terms of what needs to be done, I think that we can take a page from the way that the Data Governance Act of the EU has positioned data altruism, which I don't necessarily fully agree with, but I think that there is something to be said about creating incentives for data sharing, and public value, when explaining the public value of data, is part of that incentive. I think technology companies increasingly will realize that it is better for their users if data is being increasingly seen to be generating public value. Also for individuals and communities themselves, I think that everything that we've been reading, we realize that if as individuals and community, you realize that there is a public value to your data, you are more likely to share it. Also, if you know that there are safer mechanisms to share your data, you are more likely to share it. So how do we create, and that in that context, stewardship becomes extremely important, because we need to foster systems, not just data trusts, also cooperatives, also exchanges, also mechanisms that are far more localized, that happen at the level of the cities, of neighborhoods, that demonstrate the value of data. I think that is something that is missing in the way. I know that everybody talks about this high level value of data, but it doesn't necessarily translate into what it means for me. And we've been talking to a lot of global models that are trying to build trusts and cooperatives, and this question keeps coming back, because people will not sign on to instruments like data trust unless A, they understand it completely, and B, they recognize the value. You also, mentioned like what can we do to create more systems of accountability on some of these questions. I think that there's some interesting work that's happening out of the labor movements on the value of data. There's an increasing realization that data rights for workers are critical, and that the data generated on platforms like Uber belongs to workers as well. And increasingly, there's a recent case that's been going on in the Netherlands with the union that is being sued by Google and Ola because drivers are trying to port their data as allowed under the GDPR to make a trust, and Uber and Ola are not realizing it. So, to me, what's also interesting beyond a top-down, sort of regulatory approach to NPD, I think that this movement building around data rights that is being seen in small bits, in health data, it's also being seen. A lot of cooperatives are coming up to unlock research value of data. I think that's something that needs to be fostered, and we can put it in various ways. It's possible in the same way as you're supposed to provide EPF to employees over 20, you must make provisions for data cooperatives. Those kinds of systems can embed stewardship more bottom up and make it available to a broader group of people and organize people around questions of data rights, as opposed to this sort of ham-handed top-down approach where you're creating systems that are not necessarily anchored in the cultural or societal realities of where they exist.
Thank you. I think I agree with the whole point. Rahul, did you want to say something? Sorry, I think I saw your hand go up slightly. Okay. So no, I agree. I think in fact, that's a very interesting segue. You mentioned it, that you literally used the words which I had thought of in my follow-up question that I wanted to pose to Tatiana, which is that are we in a space, are we prematurely thinking about NPD and data trust when we are fundamentally possibly lacking in the whole data sharing idea? And the reason I wanted to pose this to Tatiana specifically was because she has her own background and expertise on data sharing, data analytics, and using that that potential to create transportation related projects. And also I'm hoping that I think in India, we are sort of in that space where we always, in a knee-jerk fashion, resort to immediately thinking about a legislative framework and thinking about regulatory steps to mandate it. But as I had said, also mentioned earlier, perhaps a softer approach and things like, as Astha mentioned, that you need a more bottoms-up approach to this. So how across different jurisdictions can something like this be done, and how can India, while developing indigenous methods, as Mr. Sawhney had said, can talk about other models and see how to evolve them into our own mold?
Of course, awesome. I mean, I think maybe to approach this question, it's good to look a little bit of, data sharing and data, actually the creation of data, kind of where we were, where we are, and where we're going. And kind of once you start seeing the trend, I actually think that, starting to talk about data trust and starting to talk about that framework is incredibly useful as of now. Maybe to take a step back also, and tapping it into what the other panelists have said. If you think about it, and really this is something that we always like to keep in mind, data sharing and the use of data analytics is an incredible tool. And it is definitely the way of the future and how we have to continue making decisions, because at the end of the day, it allows us to make better decisions, more informed decisions, more efficient decisions. But at the end of the day, it is not about data, right? It's not about collecting or sharing data for the sake of collecting and sharing data. It really is about how do we use this data and how do we use technology to get closer to better outcomes, right? So in mobility, it's about how do I improve accessibility? How do I improve, the inclusivity of my system? How do I improve customer experience, sustainability? And really, it's always really important to kind of always keep that in mind as we're even talking about, sharing methods, because even if we think about sharing data, if we're not using this data sharing protocol to get a better system, then really, why are we doing it? So it's always really good to keep that in mind. And in that sense, really what we're trying to get to is exactly what was previously said, is this is not a pilot, right? This shouldn't be seen as a one-off experiment in which we're trying to use data for a specific either planning or pilot or research purposes. But what we're trying to really get to is kind of this virtuous cycle of data, or we're using data for kind of planning purposes, but then we're actually connecting data to operations, and we're connecting that operational data to an M&E framework, and then actually cycling back to another planning process. So once we've kind of have those two frameworks of, always remembering, what are my outcomes, and then always trying to keep in mind, this is not a one-off pilot. I think we've proven the case for data multiple times over the last decade. We start looking at, okay, how do I actually create a sharing framework that allows me to get better outcomes, and then allows me to get closer to this kind of virtuous cycle of sharing. And if you look at, okay, where did we start on data sharing? If you look at, all the movements on open data that started 10, 15 years ago, it was really, you had a couple of active providers and active creators of data, right? It was a very top-down approach where you had a couple of governments, creating data and putting these data on a sharing platform. And I think that the shift that has really happened in the last, 10, 15 years is that we've gone from the creation of active data to really passive data creation, right? It's not that, you have 1, 2, 10 institutions creating data, but we're all creating data nowadays, right? Your cell phone that you're creating, you're actually a data creator. We're creating data, every single GPS on a bus is creating data. So you have this incredible source of the data that has to be replenished, but it always has to be used. And if you think about actually what COVID has done, it has actually accelerated this trend. It has accelerated the use of data. It has accelerated the use of digital tools. So I think that in that sense, if you're thinking about using a data trust structure for kind of only when we're thinking about active data, right? Only when we're thinking about sharing data from a couple of data providers, it's a quite robust structure. That the data trust is a very robust structure in that sense, and it's also a heavyweight structure, right? To maybe protect data that I think has been proven time and time again to create great value for the users, right? I think the GTFS in that sense was the the epitome of creating value for the users, right? We figured out that with a very simple data structure, we were able to communicate, you know, where all the bus routes were and how do you actually, how do you use a bus system network? So if you're looking at, you know, just a data a data trust for this kind of data, you know, active data created by governments that really does not have any kind of sensitive data, might be a little bit heavyweight. But if you think of, you know, if you always keep in mind on, okay, where's the system going? Where's the data sharing going? This is where data trusts become incredibly useful and incredibly powerful. Because, you know, as Rahul mentioned and a couple of other panelists mentioned, we're moving to a point of that, you know, there's going to be very difference between, you know, personal and not personal data. And where does that, you know, and how do we always protect user data? So if you think about, you know, we actually at the World Bank created essentially, back in the day, we weren't using the name data trust, but essentially it was a data trust, which was called open traffic. And essentially what we did here was we started to pull data from ride-hailing companies. And with this pool of data, then we were actually able to ask questions and ask it once it was in a pooled data trust, we were actually able to figure out a lot about the system itself. And in creating this virtuous cycle of the business model, actually then we started to interact with companies themselves and give them insights on kind of how the system was performing, all the while protecting sensitive and confidential information. So I think that, you know, if you think, as I said, you know, where we were, data trusts were maybe nothing that we were talking about. Where we are is where we need to get ready for data. You know, the data that's going to be shared is going to be personalized, is going to be personally identifiable, and data trusts create, you know, data trusts provide an incredibly secure way of sharing this kind of data that also allows us to propose the right questions to provide, you know, better access, better inclusivity, better customer experience, and all the while creating a virtuous cycle of how do we share data and how do we use data, again, not as one pilot, but actually there's a virtuous cycle that always gets implemented throughout the planning cycle, throughout operations, and through the M&E, the M&E framework. So, you know, I think that it's an incredibly useful tool. I commend really for even starting to think about it. And actually, you know, it's easy to say the word data trust, but actually from that to implementation, as you were seeing, you know, the technology is hard to do. So I think it's a great step on. It's a very good step on a journey that we'll all have to take when we're thinking about the future of data and how we use and share data.
Thanks, Tatiana. I think yes, I think one of the points that even the position paper tries to sort of delve deeper into is that while the NPD committee also talked about the benefits of data trusts, especially in safeguarding and protecting community interests, we did along with the team from Cyril, Amarchand, Mangaldas did like a legal analysis of the existing legislative framework in India to see whether what the different facets that a data trust needs to showcase, is the law capable of depicting those, and is the law capable of allowing such an entity to even be incorporated in the first place. Like, you may have something that mimics the nature of a data trust, or is a quasi data trust, but not what you will term as an optimal data trust, performing all the 10 or 15 different functions that it needs to. So on that, I would actually want to hear from Richa, because she was part of the CAM team that spearheaded this part, and also from Trishi, from Vidhi. My question again is, like, we found, like, our paper basically, I think, in a gist concludes that the current legislative framework is sort of inadequate if you are talking about the creation of a data trust and if you wanted to scale ubiquitously. And we propose in turn for that the new bespoke legislation that should work. And we also suggest some facets and some principles that such a legislation should encapsulate. So can we hear a bit more on that? Can we hear what the law needs to look like if you're talking about data trusts in their optimal state for India? Richa, yeah.
Sure. Happy to. So first of all, thank you so much. It's always such a pleasure to collaborate with Vidhi on anything. So the report as well as this panel, and it's thanks for such a sort of stellar panel, and it's lovely to hear such spirited engagement from all of them. And I just want to kind of start by saying, I think that, there could not be a more timely moment to be discussing public goods in general, as we're all waiting with bated breath for this vaccine, and also to be discussing data as a public good and data trusts as sort of a stewardship model for that as a public good. And I think it's in that spirit that it's useful to think about what the bespoke nature of this entity should look like and how it should get regulated. And I'm happy to kind of pick up on some of the comments that the other panelists have made in this context. And I think, in thinking about how the existing framework and paradigm is inadequate, and why we therefore need a bespoke one, I think it's important to think about a couple of things. One is, the character of data itself, and therefore how it can be sort of shaped into any of the existing forms of organization that we have, as well as the existing regulatory framework that we have, and whether that is fit for purpose for what we're seeking to do here. And I mean, I think, in terms of the character of data, it is, there is the raw data and there is the intelligence that's built upon it. And I think most forms of organization that we're thinking about think about either property, or they think about a business activity, neither of which I think, the way we're conceiving of data in a data trust are appropriate for. And I mean, so property, traditionally it's a bundle of rights, and we think about it in the context of title and transfer, and what can you do with it. I think data, particularly non-public data, in the way that we've thought about it in the report, and admittedly sort of not as widely as in the context of sort of data that's created, say, by a corporation, which I think Mr. Matthan alluded to. So if it's community data and not that which resides in an individual, I think it's the paradigm of property is not sort of useful to think about it in that way, and therefore we can't think of it as a private trust where you bestow some property upon the trust which is held for the benefit of identifiable individuals. Similarly, I think for the reasons that we've been discussing in the context of the trade-off between public interest as well as the private interest of profit, which is certainly a very useful thing to do. I think, we do want there to be money because of sustainability, but we want to balance the public interest with that. So I think for that reason, a charitable organization like a public trust or even a Section 8 company for that matter is not very useful. And then also, the whole idea of governance, and we can talk about that in some more detail in terms of, whether the fiduciary, the idea of, fiduciary responsibility is appropriately captured in any of the existing models. And I think, the answer is no, even though the New Companies Act has all of these ideas about the corporation needs to be responsible to all stakeholders, including the environment, community, employees, and others. So I think there is that. And also, I think, just to build upon I think what something that Astha said, which also we've sort of alluded to in the report, that the data that's created is really in non-personal data in the way that we conceived it is not just not an individual idea, but also that it's it's iterative in that, it's built from, multiple people and their effort. So when you say, Uber owns data, and, maybe this is different from what Rahul was saying about, Trilegal owning data, can they share it? But, if Uber's sharing data, it's not something that they own in the intellectual properties right sense of the word, because it's created by every person who hails a cab and every driver who drives, the cab for them. And therefore, it should have a public nature to it. And there are, there are sort of several other public interest reasons around why it should be shared more publicly. And I think nationalization is certainly a problem, but I mean, sharing it publicly for other kinds of uses, particularly for uses, that are either academic or public interest uses, including uses by the state with sort of, accountability and, boundary conditions, and all of that is certainly quite necessary. I think it is useful as well. And that's why I think any of the existing, legal vehicles that exist are inadequate and I'd argue even inappropriate for what we are thinking of as non-personal data and for its stewardship role and the stewardship idea. I think that's one of the reasons why we recommended a bespoke structure, which incorporates some of the ideas that we have that we've sort of set out in a little more detail in the report. So it should have sort of an enforceable fiduciary duty from the public in general, and not just sort of shareholders, or not just sort of an individual set of people. And I think that also incorporates, and I think maybe that's something we can set out in a lot more detail. It also has rights and duties of the data sharer and the data user, and the duty to contribute data, to contribute it, subject to again sort of in accuracy and various other hygiene conditions that you'd like to build around the data, as well as layered governance models and so on. I'd also like to speak briefly about regulation, if I may. And I think, I very much take on board what Astha has said about the issues with a top-down regulatory model. And this is something, you probably remember, this is something that we had a lot of debate and discussion about until almost the very end of the report. And I think, I think the regulatory framework in India in other sectors, which is basically what we have to draw on, is certainly inadequate. And I think, I think we do need regulation because, voice and exit, which are the two traditional ways in which you can sort of police actors, are not always sufficient. And we know this from all of the issues we're facing with technology companies recently, and sort of, the breakdown of, Gmail and Google a few days ago is, only only underscores that. So I think we do need regulation, but I think the model of regulation needs to be very different. I think it needs to be independent in the true sense. It needs to be sort of stakeholder driven, bottom up. As Astha says, absolutely. I think it needs to be accountable. I think it needs to be clear. And, when we say accountability, it's things like, be clear about why we need the regulations. So start with the why. What is the purpose that we're seeking to achieve by regulating something? And then sort of regularly actually monitor as to whether you're meeting that regulation. What are the unintended consequences? What are the transaction costs of the regulation? Is that higher than what you were seeking to achieve by the regulation in the first place? And also sort of stakeholder related models to keep the regulator accountable, to prevent regulatory capture, which I think is a real risk in India as well. So I think, I think I'll stop there, but I think, maybe later in the conversation, we can tease out some of this a little more. Good to hear from Trishi.
Thanks a lot, Richa. I think that's a very, I have to say, very holistic overview of maybe like 2/3 of the paper that we've written. So thank you for that. Trishi, I just wanted to also circle back, like I think like in our paper, and I used this terminology consciously in my last question as well. We've tried to define what an optimal data trust is, and like in critiquing the existing legislative framework, one of our arguments has been that we will not attain optimal data trust. We will have something that is a quasi data trust or mimics the nature of it. So just to get us better sense on that, so I think like we base it in the idea of a data commons approach, and I just wanted to hear more on that, and like a better explainer of where we are coming from when we are arguing it, as like what currently we have is not optimal and what would be optimal for the law to consider.
Right. So I think firstly, what our objective with looking at a data trust or even any stewardship model was just to look at how we can differentiate between our current ownership-based discussion of data versus how we can talk about what the role of the community is. Largely why, and largely this comes from the fact that we do believe that there is a tendency to pit interests against each other, which is one is that of the people who collect the data and then may gain some kind of confidentiality or IP-based ownership of that data, versus the people who are, let's say, for lack of a better word, the subjects of the data, the people whose interactions are captured within that data. And I think it's so the data commons approach speaks to that for us, which is that we would like to think of an institutional framework that can actually enable the active participation of the community. That is, yes, it's true, right now it remains rather amorphous, but I think that's also because this question of a data trust or a data commons is also coming from something that isn't necessarily based in like a prototype that we have right now. I think when we're talking about even something like a knowledge commons, the contours of what you would call the stakeholders or the community, they change with that context. So for instance, if we're talking about urban mobility data, we could easily say that, let's say the community would include not simply the members of the or the commuters that take Delhi buses, but also include the people that contribute towards the collection of that data. So if we're looking at, for instance, here it would be TTC that is collecting this data. They also so the idea is that the data commons is not necessarily meant to be something that is solving for us versus them. Rather, it's a part where you look at both members of the same community are interacting with each other. And of course, I understand that this is something that that remains aspirational. The idea of a commons that really works, there are scattered sort of approaches to this, and fairly scattered kind of even pilots that have gone into this. But I think what we felt was still compelling was the sort of common principles that we could gain from the variety of commons that have been set up. Now, one caveat here is that, of course, a data commons is very different from what we would think is a property-based commons or a natural resource-based commons, where you have a defined property. Like if I'm saying that this land is now subject to a commons, it's very different from us saying that this data is subject to a commons, because data remains something that can keep building on top of each other, and it's not necessarily the same, and even the community is not necessarily as well defined when it comes to a property based commons. But at the same time, we felt that there are certain examples of a commons based institutional governance framework that have created the sort of, or have led to the objectives that we sort of wish to achieve with a data trust, let's say, which is that we want to be able to create a mechanism that allows for greater sharing of the data. And at the same time, it's not that this data sharing is something that is completely unregulated or completely, unaccounted for, where there are some kind of responsibilities that arise even with the use of this data. Now, of course, it's not the same as us talking about the kind of responsibilities you get with, personal data, where certain specific legal obligations have already been put in place through, let's say, ongoing legislation. I mean, right now the legislative effort is still pending, but globally there are several, models that have given some kind of concrete ideas about what an obligation for that could be anyway. But for non-personal data specifically, I think there is, we do need to look at how we can define those certain broader responsibilities. For instance, ensuring that this data is definitely used in the community interest, which is that if you're contributing to the creation of this data, it is used for your benefit. It is not necessarily used to, let's say in the urban mobility context, for creating search pricing that enables some kind of, which actually then leads to a benefit for one member of the community as against the other. And I think those are the types of things that we sort of thought that the data commons approach can necessarily account for. And a data trust specifically gives that one additional advantage of even including people who aren't necessarily clued into these transactions. So, we can look at marketplaces and cooperatives, but I think those don't necessarily enable that kind of direct engagement with the community. The reason primarily being that if you're looking at, for instance, a data cooperative, they might the idea is that it will still be constituted in the context of non-personal data by the people who collect the data and then therefore share that data. But in the case of a data trust, what it does is it goes beyond that by also including some kind of directly actionable kind of duties that can be inquired of by somebody who is contributing to that data, somebody who's a member of the public. And there have been certain things that have been going, I mean, there are some very interesting efforts abroad where commons have been created in a very different manner. But I think there also there's two things that happen. So for instance, if you look at Barcelona, they've done some very interesting research on creating a data commons including the people directly in municipal governance. But what happens there is that they've also actively, as a municipal government, gone and taught people what this data means. And this is actually speaking to what Astha has also meant, that there is a need to create that bottom-up level effort. But sadly, the thing is that, like, within India, that type of awareness or that type of catching on to this idea of what this value of data means hasn't necessarily taken off yet. And of course, the idea is that even with the data trust, we would want to be able to enable that, which is where we propose, say, local level community participation. Now, examples of that could be, let's say, collectivization of RWAs, because in a municipal area, that's one of the ways that you can get local level participation going, which is representative. So I mean, the idea still remains that it's drawing still from the idea of how we can get more data shared, and how we can get that data shared in a way that people who aren't necessarily always participating in this decision making do get a say, and you create those actionable duties towards them. So yeah, I'll just conclude here. I think that's primarily what we sort of hoped to achieve with this idea of a data trust.
Thank you. No, I agree. I think that I think like we're running a bit behind the clock, so I just want to circle on like a few other questions that I had. Veering a bit away from the intricacies of data trusts and how they are going to be accomplished, I had a question more on the taxonomy of non-personal data, personal data again. And since Rahul had mentioned this, I would pose this to him and Mr. Madhukar. So as even Mr. Sawhney had mentioned that now the government is considering bringing everything, or like for the time being, bringing both non-personal data and personal data within the remit of the same, what was earlier the PDP bill, but will now, again, I think we renamed as the Data Protection Bill. My only question, and I wanted some quick thoughts on this, was that is this a wise move given how the PDP bill, through its short historicity, has been geared towards the protection of personal data? And that has been the primary discourse that it has been featured in. And now suddenly they're including on a very 11th hour notice, like this whole new element of non-personal data. Is this, in your opinion, a wise move, or should this be reconsidered? Rahul, can you go first?
Sure. So look, as I started out saying, given that these are two sides of the coin, in a sense, there is some merit in having the same regulator look at it, because at some point in time, personal data will stop being personal data when it is anonymized, and then it passes on to becoming non-personal data. And similarly, non-personal data, if it becomes identifiable, if the anonymization is broken, or for various other reasons it becomes identifiable, it becomes personal data again. And if we can, I can see the logic in suggesting it. We don't need to. We could have an appropriate mechanism whereby the PDP regulator and the NPD regulator actually can hand off data in an efficient manner, depending on whether it is personal data or if it's non-personal data, and that should suffice. I think so that's just to answer the regulator question. I have a fundamental question with, as I argued before, with actually using this kind of exclusionary definition. I don't think it benefits anyone. And if that is the case, then depending on the actual taxonomy of the data that we're looking at. So if currently we're looking at capturing all data, either within PDP or NPD, then it makes sense to either have a single regulator or to have a regulator, two regulators that work very closely together. That is not the ideal structure in my view. And so if we are creating a structure where, for instance, the purpose of the structure is data for good, and data for public good. And then, we're saying, look, we're going to open up public data sets, that is data sets that are funded by public money. At the second stage, we're going to open, data sets that are created by private parties, but that have tremendous and a very high bar of public good value. Then, I think then there is some merit in creating a sort of a bespoke regulator, because we need to see what we're trying to achieve with regulating that particular definition, that particular category of data as I've defined it. And there may be many objectives, and the paper articulates quite a few of them. There is this concern that there is this network effects could prevent parties, that is new entrants into the field, from actually participating. Now, that is a very sort of entrepreneur-driven approach. There is the concern that this could cause profiling of people, because the non-personal data provides you with insights into the person that is not obviously available. Now, that is a very privacy-driven concern. And so you have many of these different sorts of concerns. And then, of course, there is the overarching construct that a lot of people are talking about, which is that we've got to unlock this data such that the value can be used in other contexts that the original creator of the data didn't envisage. That's a very public good kind of an approach. So I think if we're thinking through how to regulate it, we've got to spend a lot of time figuring out what these objectives are. And more precisely, we've got to articulate somehow the unintended harms that can come out of doggedly pursuing this data for public good approach without fully understanding what the privacy concerns are, the competition concerns are, etc., or even trying to regulate it with the regulatory language of competition when actually the objective is privacy. I have to commend the government of India for actually engaging with this, because this is a very vast and very complex subject. So I want to agree with what you're saying, Amin, which is that this is an 11th hour kind of an intervention. And I think just including it at this 11th hour would do it a disservice. We need to spend the time to consider this. I think, I completely endorse what Mr. Ajay Sawhney said right at the beginning, which is it's time for India to come up with its own models and for the rest of the world to copy and paste us. But the only way the rest of the world is going to copy and paste us is if this model is robust. And so I think we need to spend the time to make this model robust, think about all of these various concerns and articulate them so that it then becomes a thought-through model that the rest of the world can look at and use.
Thank you. Mr. Madhukar?
Yeah, no, I think the problem we are trying to solve is an important one. I don't think the bottleneck is regulation as far as data trusts are concerned. I think the bottleneck in my mind is to create the business logic. When I say business, I'm not saying the logic of the public good that is being prevented right now because we don't have a law. The paper, of course, makes a bit of a case, but I think it'd be worth digging a lot deeper to say really what is the problem we're trying to solve and why do we need a new law or a framework that will allow us to do it beyond what the paper has done so far. That's probably what I might have to say.
Thank you. We are a bit short on time, but I do have a couple of questions. So if we are all okay with it, I would like to extend just by 10 minutes and request the panelists to give again, as I mentioned, very precise comments on the questions I had. So I just also I again want to go a bit into quickly into we're talking about data trusts. We have talked about, as you mentioned, as was rightly stated, that if it becomes too onerous, then maybe the companies won't have a buy-in. I think there is a glaring question, which is one, how do we incentivize the concept of data trust? Is a legal mandate the only way to do it? And secondly, as I think to some extent even Tatiana was mentioning this, and I think a few other panelists also referred, that there are these piecemeal pilots that have happened from time to time, but it's not really a sustainable method. And as Rahul just mentioned, that if we want other countries to sort of derive from our models, we need robustness, we need sustainability in our models. So quick question to both Tatiana and Astha. On one, how do we incentivize data trusts going forward, and how do we scale and make them sustainable? Either of you can go first. Tatiana, you can go first. Sorry.
Sounds good. I mean, I think that they become really valuable when essentially they. So sorry. I think that the main thing that a data trust provides is security and accountability. That is an incredible thing that for a private provider, knowing that they're going to be sharing data into a certain kind of pool is key for them, to know that the data is going to be secure and to understand what it's used for. So in that sense, you already, you have one step of the way, which is, the value that the data trust provides to the company, It provides to the user of the data, it provides another, but in general, that sense of security is definitely one of the key things. And I think, really when we're going to get to this virtual cycle, when it's not a pilot, is when we really actually are able to show how this data ties into better outcomes, And it's about creating these win-win opportunities where, the person providing the data is getting something in return. That might be better information on customer experience, better information, more users. And the user is also getting somewhere, right? Somehow, some benefit. So in that sense, if we're thinking about bus services providing information on their GPS, the user has to get some benefit in terms of better information on their service, knowing when the next bus is going to come. But the provider also has to get some benefit. And, that might be creating tools for monitoring and evaluation. That might be creating open tools that allows, the provider to actually understand how the performance of the bus is going. That's just one small example, if you think of how the open traffic model worked, essentially what we did is everybody from the ride-hailing providers pulled in this data, and essentially we got two big sets of outputs. One output was creating data to understand kind of origin destination patterns and actually congestions on the roads, which we were able to actually tie into better policy making, better information. But then to the actual provider, what we returned was actually congestion models. And this might seem quite simple, right? But for somebody like a ride-hailing company, being able to say that the next car is going to be there 5 minutes versus 15 minutes is a huge difference in terms of customer experience. These companies actually, tend to spend millions of dollars just doing queries to Google Maps, being able to tell when the congestion models is coming. So, and not to get very much into the details or into the weeds of this example, but I think that is what really this open traffic model exploited, which is creating win-win opportunities where both sides, the user and the provider had benefits from actually providing data into the trust. And at the same time, if you create the trust in a way that it is actually secure and provides the right level of security, that is really when you start creating these, you start unlocking the potential of this virtuous circle.
Astha?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with everything that Tatiana said. We need to uncover and communicate this value. We need to do it across stakeholders. We need to do it for businesses, for government, for communities, for individuals. We also need to, think about more critically on the business models, like how are these data trusts really going to survive? What does financial sustainability look like for them as we, because for entities that we believe need to be in public interest and are potentially non-profits, grant-funded data trust doesn't sound like, the best way forward. They're never sustainable. So we need to think about alternative business models, which is, we had experimented with the idea of union dues, of thinking about how commons are monetized and then profits are shared. There is some interesting work happening around that as well. And then I think Trishi mentioned Barcelona. It gives you a good sense of how you can really embed the idea of data sharing more broadly within, a city level regulation, because I think that that's the right level for these models. Also to incentivize existing behaviors that are happening. There are lots of research partnerships that companies like Uber, etc., have taken with universities, with think tanks to share data. What Pravesh is doing is also an extremely critical effort to share data, and those kinds of partnerships also need to be encouraged and incentivized so that we build this culture of sharing. So I think, to me, it's not just about creating data trusts, but creating different avenues where data sharing can be facilitated, both through these partnership, through trust, through bottom-up efforts, as I spoke about earlier, because it's a very big problem, and it's going to be different from mobility to health to environmental research to labor rights. All of these are data issues, and the models and the partnerships that we see in each of these sectors is likely to be different and will need different levels to unlock that ecosystem. So I think that instead of being model driven in all of this, we need to be ecosystem led. What does this space need? And then build from there.
Thank you. I think that particular point is well taken, and I think extremely important, that while we are talking about data governance at the day's end, subjective requirements of every sector need to be considered. And then there are some macro level challenges, as Trishi had also pointed out, that we have people where our digital literacy is not that great. Not just digital literacy in general, but particularly understanding the implications of data analytics and data harvesting and things like that. That is something that I think as a demographic, we possibly are lagging behind a bit. So with that set of comments, I do want to conclude this discussion. I believe we are already running overtime, so unfortunately we will not have any capacity to take questions from the audience right now. But I think this was extremely helpful for us as authors of our paper as well. And I would say that before we depart, like if any of you, if any of the panelists or from the audience, like our report is available on the Vidhi website. And if you have any feedback, if you have any inputs and thoughts, because this is a conversation where this report was meant to be just like an initiation point, we would be building on this and hopefully taking this up with the ministry and with the requisite stakeholders. So if you have inputs, if you have thoughts, ideas, please do share with us and let us know. We would be welcoming any such efforts from the plethora of stakeholders for whom I believe this conversation is vital as we are having it. With that, I wish all of you a good day. Thank you for joining us, to all the panelists and all the people who tuned in. And yes, see you soon, hopefully at another Vidhi event. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye. Thank you very much.